Okay, everybody. Should we make a start now? Okay. I'll just introduce myself first. I think I forgot to do that at the beginning of the day. My name's Dave Clements. I'm a writer on social policy. I also work in local government, which I hope will be helpful. I'm convener of the Institute of Ideas Social Policy Forum and co-editor of the Future of Community Report of the Deaf Greatly Exaggerated. When I first suggested that we have a debate on the big society, I was politely urged to have a rethink. This was a few months ago. I was also urged to perhaps relegate any mention of the big society to the bottom of the blurb of an entirely different session. Now, I think since then things have moved on a bit. It's no longer regarded as a flimsy bit of branding that will soon blow over, which was the general view only a few months ago. So, what is the big society? Why are we talking about it? And what has it got to do with the good society? And I don't mean the new Miliband version of the good society, whatever that might be. So it's not about cuts. I think we need to get that out of the way quite early on. The comprehensive spending review is going to have an impact. Local authorities are facing cuts of something like 30% over the next 4 years. So that's significant and obviously it will have an impact. But I think we have to recognise that Cameron was talking about the big society to anybody who would listen, which wasn't many at the time, long before the election, long before the economic crisis. But I think there's more to the big society even than public services. So the government has quite recently, and a bit late in the day, tried to define what the big society is. It's said there are three core components: empowering communities, opening up public services, and promoting what it calls social action, which seems to be the new word for social capital. It sounds a bit more, I don't know, dynamic. Cameron has talked about his profound faith in people and his healthy awareness of the state's limitations. Too much government, he says, can inhibit things like volunteering and just wanting to get involved. And it can undermine people's sense of responsibility for themselves, he says. I don't think it's especially right-wing or libertarian. Cameron doesn't talk about a small state, for instance, he just talks about a different one. He wants to be an agitator for social renewal, which I think sounds rather third way, he might argue. Blair also talked about a new facilitating role for the state. So what's new? At a debate earlier this week, Matthew Taylor, a former advisor to Blair and also not averse to Cameron, gave a talk in which he described the big society as being about behaviour change and creating better citizens. Again, it implies a new role for the state, an active role for the state as well as creating active citizens. So I think hopefully we can try to get to grips with some of these contradictions and perhaps come up with our own notion of what we think the big society is and whether it's a good thing or not. So I'll introduce our speakers in the order that they're going to speak. To my immediate left we have Councillor Steve Breed. He's leader of Lambeth Council, Deputy Chairman of the Local Government Association and Labour's Deputy Leader in Local Government nationally. Steve launched a major public consultation in May 2010 on proposals to establish Lambeth as Britain's first cooperative council, to encourage public sector organisations to work more closely with communities and service users to deliver more responsive services that offer better value for money. And that's one of the reasons that we invited him to speak, to tell us a little bit about that. Kevin Harris, far left, not politically necessarily, but geographically, is a community development consultant with the local level, a consultancy that he set up in 2005. He's also a widely published writer who focuses on the ways in which policy relates to neighbourhoods and local people relate to policy. He has almost 25 years' experience in the community development field. He's chair of the Watford Community Development Network and author of Neighbourhoods blog, which has been publishing since 2003. And it's a very good blog, so I do urge you to read that. It's picked up quite a lot by The Guardian online. Finally, on my right is James Panton. He's a politics tutor at St John's College, University of Oxford, and co-founder of the Radical Civil Liberties campaigning group, the Manifesto Club. He's currently working on a project which looks at the political elite's attitude to political apathy in Britain and America in the 1950s and 1990s, which again I hope might be relevant to our discussion. James writes on politics, education, intellectual life and civil liberties, and he regularly takes part in television and radio discussions on those and other themes. So, without further ado, I'll pass over to Steve.
Thank you. We've been told to speak right into the microphone, so I'm sorry if you can't see me at the back. And good afternoon. Yeah, we in Lambeth, we went public with our proposals, the first set of proposals to turn Lambeth into a cooperative council back in February. It was, much before the election. I almost choked into my cornflakes a few months later when I heard David Cameron announce the big society in terms that sounded very similar to the ones that we were already starting to pursue. But for me, the ideas around cooperation and mutualism and self-help have always been part of the progressive tradition in British politics, and I think there's a political attempt to take language that is progressive to cover something which isn't progressive, which is the marketisation of public services, which is what I think the Tory agenda is really about. But why are we doing this in Lambeth? Why do we think this is important? Well, first, I think public services are under threat, and if they do not change and adapt, they will not survive, not in the way that we've come to know them. It's not just a political threat. The Tory government, in my view, does not believe in public services. If you look at what they're doing in areas like education or housing or health, the market is their ideological driver. They want to marketise public services. Secondly, public services are under threat because of the reducing level of confidence that the public have in them. And you see this over the last 10 years. The Labour government invested huge amounts of money in public services, but key services like health and the police, public confidence in those services was going down, even though external assessment of those services was showing that the level of service being provided was increasing. So there's somewhere a disconnect between the public and the services they receive, and I think into that space comes the opportunity for the political right to bring in the market to take over those services if we don't find a different way to deliver them. Third point is the financial crisis. I don't think this model is necessarily financially driven or cuts-driven initially, but we operate in a context where the discretionary budget for my council was cut last week from 310 million to 220 million, an enormous cut of £90 million. And that of itself means the existing business model is bust, and we need to find a new way to deliver those services. The fourth point is, I think the existing settlement between the citizen and the state is no longer sustainable. We need to rethink what kind of society we want to be, and therefore what kind of public services we need to be delivering and how we need to deliver them in order to achieve that. And some of the ways that people feel about the state, and I think this links back to the lack of confidence. People feel too much. It's one size fits all. Public services are something that is done to you and that you don't have enough control over. In many other areas of life, people now experience huge amounts of choice, and they are demanding that in public services as well. And we have not yet found ways to make public services responsive enough. And then there's the other problem of that kind of doing it to people rather than letting them choose, which is that it becomes immensely disempowering. And we do have problems with high levels of welfare dependency and the crushing of some people's aspiration. So they learn how to play the system rather than how to make the most of their lives. Now, if we start to try and reshape that settlement between the citizen and the state so that we can move people from being passive recipients of services to become active shapers of services, I think we can find, we have within that idea the core of what public services might become. It operates differently in different service areas. In housing, for instance, cooperative housing models, shared equity models, allow people on low or fixed incomes to meet their aspiration to own without being sucked into the problems we have with subprime lending, which led to the global economic crash, as well as huge amounts of human misery for families that are thrown out of their homes and made homeless, as well as much more immediate control over the housing services that are being delivered where you live. If you look at adult care services, personalised budgets, so giving people the value of the services they're receiving, but allowing them to choose instead what they want to receive, is delivering hugely changed choices from users who are choosing different outcomes and how they want to achieve them. And we're starting to see now personalised budget holders come together in micro mutuals of purchasers, which is radically changing the market because it is creating micro mutuals of providers, often within the same community as the users. And that is delivering us better outcomes for lower cost. I'm very interested too in community commissioned youth services. Instead of councils and the public sector deciding what is going to happen on an estate where we have high levels of, for instance, violent youth crime or gang activity. We're finding ways to support those communities themselves, to analyse the problems that they have in their particular hyper-locality, and then procure and commission the services they need to resolve that problem. We're getting much better outcomes as a result of putting those resources and professionals at the disposal of the community. And after this session, Chair, I'm off down to the south of Lambeth to join a community group digging over a piece of wasteland to turn it into a piece of community space. And they're coming out to do that because they want to have control over the place where they live. They don't just want the council coming in and raising that area to the ground and then seeing the problem of dereliction come back again. So there's 4 quick examples of different ways that this new model of co-production, working together, can change public services, restore public confidence and strengthen civil society.
Kevin.
Thanks, Dave. Is everybody hear me all right? I realise it's very packed at the back and I'm not getting any signals. Somebody raise a hand. Yeah, good, cool, thank you. Okay. I see Big Society as a brand. To me, it's a brand that's wrapped around a number of motherhood and apple pie type ideas with which most of us are more than comfortable, I think. And it's striking for me. I wonder how many heads are being scratched in Labour Party administration because they had all the components, or perhaps nearly all the components, except the brand. So that's something for another time to discuss. What it seems to me has happened is that Big Society has started a public discussion about broad cultural change in a positive mood, which I think is pretty smart political trick to play. It's good ideas management. Within that, I don't quite agree with Dave's introductory remarks that this is not anything to do with financial crisis. A guy called Carol Williams, I believe, quoted by William Davies on his blog recently, pointed out that we live in a society in which massive gains are privatised and massive losses are socialised. And we've demonstrated what a stupid way of doing things that is. And it troubles me that Big Society doesn't address that at all. A few remarks. I want to start by talking about the heavy dependence in Big Society rhetoric on the word community and the implications somehow that represents consensus. It's as if the country is kind of neatly parcelled into identifiable neighbourhoods, and there are clusters of people there who all readily agree with one another and work out what needs to be done. Also identify the fact that nobody's done these things yet or tried in their councils to do so, and then they'll get out there and do it. Not only is this politically a bit unfortunate and unhealthy, it's patronising to require or imply that people will act alike and think alike. So there's a little problem there. I like the idea put forward by David Halpern, who's now in the Cabinet Office, that it's not about doing more with less, it's about doing more with more. I like that, it's powerful, the more coming from the stimulation of civic involvement. Is this new civic energy going to be evenly distributed? No, I don't think so. Are there strategies in place to deal with that uneven distribution? I've not seen them. I'm not aware of them. So there's a little problem there. There's another point, which is that within the localities, there is going to be unevenness in access to influence within, in terms of influencing this agenda. I mean, we have this all the time, the classic of adults squeezing young people out of public space and so forth. It happens all the time, so it's not going to change, I don't think. I want to say a word about the community organisers. We have this programme coming up next year of the training of 5,000 community organisers, what I call the leading of the 5,000. I worry a little bit. We know how these programmes work. There's a template, they'll be rushed through. Community development depends on values and principles. If they're not in there, it isn't community development. And I worry a little bit about how those values will come through in that programme. I want to say a quick word about permissions, and this is about the relationship between residents and their councils. Just a curiosity for me, it strikes me that Big Society gives residents more emphatically permission to bash their councils about things that they think should be done and aren't being done. But it also gives councils permission to say, well, if that's what you want, go and do it. There you go, off you go and do it. Rolling back the state, this is a point about exclusion. I won't be long, Dave. A quick point about exclusion. Rolling back the state, for me, polarises those for whom it's okay and those for whom it's not. This is a general point, I know, but people who experience exclusion don't tend to have options. Now then, I'll offer you quickly an example. I know most people have their own of this, and this is a very important point for me. An example that I know of a town near where I live, a resource centre which has a reputation well beyond the town, takes an £8,000 grant from the council and gets bullied by the council, incidentally. They're smart, they know their social return on investment, they've done the sums, they deliver £86,000 worth of services. They are now looking at between either a 50 or 100% cut. You'll have your own examples. And the question I have is, how are people expected to react when the community initiatives that they have put passion and energy into, usually unrewarded, usually unrecognised, which are consistent with big society principles, how are they going to react when they're wiped out? And I fear that what we're going to see is a lot of new civic energy in some areas and a lot of sense of exhaustion and depletion in others.
Thank you, Kevin. James.
Thanks, Dave. I've always kind of denied being dyslexic, but I was convinced Dave's email had said speak for 35 minutes, and upstairs he told me 3 to 5. So anyway, I'll try and do that. So I guess that means I'm essentially going to make 1 point rather than 12. And I mean, I suppose I'd start by saying, you know, I find the much of the rhetoric, much of the presentation, much of the what appears to be some of the philosophy of the big society hugely appealing. What's not to like in the idea of community empowerment? What's not to like in the idea of getting rid of some of the more ludicrous bits of bureaucratic regulation and control, whether that be in terms of health and safety or the kind of formalised politicisation and legislation of everyday life. What's not to like in the notion of citizens coming together, controlling their lives and rebuilding society? And I think, as Steve has already alluded to, you know, there is a big continuity in the actual practice of what's being proposed to what was proposed and what was in part already in place under the previous government. And we can go further. So, you know, you have people like Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian who says that actually this is all has its origins in a pre-Fabian Labour tradition, and thus Labour should reclaim the big society as those pre-Fabian roots. And Tessa Jowell says it's a brass neck rebranding. And God himself, talk about clash of egos, also wants to claim the big society as his idea, or at least according to the Bishop of Stafford, who tells us that the big society is the essence of Christ's message, and who am I to disagree with that? One sense in which people from a whole load of different perspectives might be attracted to the big society is precisely because it seems to cover a whole load of different things and not clarify very much about any of them. Cameron says, call it liberalism, call it empowerment, call it freedom, call it responsibility, call it good citizenship. I call it the big society. Hate to be picky, but that's a whole load of things that the big society is or might be, and I'm not sure which. I think my one point then is that the appeal that there is, which I think is a very broad appeal of, if you like, rolling back the state, allowing communities to develop, allowing citizens to take more control of their lives and of the kind of lives they lead and of the society they live in. That is there on one level in terms of the idea of transferring responsibility for certain public services from centralised state to other issues. But actually I think on another level what we're actually looking at is a far expanded role for the state and parastate institutions and legislative institutions in everyday lives. Society's broken, and the big society is all about how we go about fixing it. But obviously we can't actually be trusted to do that ourselves, which is why the state has to, I think, very clearly expand its role to become an agitator for social renewal. So if you think about some of the key big society initiatives that have been much lauded, and this is not, I hope, to caricature. These are, lots of the things that I read about in the paper as the big initiatives that are all part of the big society. So we have the big lunch, which Cameron loves, the lottery funds, as does private enterprise, which will give us the means to get together in our communities over lunch, to rebuild communities by sharing ideas between neighbours and across generations, and between ethnic groups, and presumably sharing our different samosas and cuts of roast beef and falafel, and then pointing out that that level of saturated fat might not be a good idea, so maybe we should all eat something different. We have the promise of the training of 5,000 community organisers who will parachute in to identify how communities can be rebuilt, and community leaders who can be identified within those communities already, who can then be trained to lead their communities. The establishment of a national citizen service programme for 16-year-olds to help them develop the skills that they need to be active and responsible citizens. The Big Society Mega Classroom that Nick Clegg opened last week, an £8 million centre in Sutton that uses virtual reality scenarios to help children understand and cope with bullying, different scenarios to help them cope, called the Transport Zone, to help them cope with the problems they could face on the tube and the bus. Presumably, I don't know, teach them how to get tickets, I don't know. And indeed, the home zone where they'll learn how to prevent fires. And then we've got care credits, which was all over the news this morning. I'm sure many of you seen. By volunteering with all people in my community, I will guarantee that I'll be looked after. Really, I'll guarantee that I'll be looked after because I'll have amassed a body of credits by the voluntary work that I put in with old people now. Being a big fan of lunch, and the bigger the better, I'm happy with the idea of lunch. I'm not entirely convinced that I need government support or lottery money or private enterprise support to help me socialise with my neighbours over lunch. And if I'm entirely honest, I'm not convinced that there are that many of my neighbours that I actually want to share lunch with in the first place. I'm not convinced that we need these kind of projects to teach children how to get on and off buses, or indeed how to deal with bullying. You might think that big brothers, parents, friends, and indeed local communities could have some role to play in some of those kinds of things, rather than the notion of big schools to train them to do it. So I think this is perhaps also, my slight reticence is presumably why we need to train up 16-year-olds in how to be good citizens, because I'm already beyond the pale. I'm already too critical of what's being suggested. So maybe if we catch people at 16, then we can encourage them to understand what good citizenship should look like. So the rhetoric is about stepping back. The rhetoric is about freeing us up to control our communities and run our lives more, but I think the underlying philosophy is that actually we can't be trusted to do that. And just my final point, I promise, worth remembering, I think, that the same week that the Big Society was launched, calling for citizens to engage in civic life, build communities, campaign more for what they want and for what they need, the government also shut down that very same week the Democracy Village on Parliament Square. So, there we have supporting civic activism, strong communities and citizens get together to campaign for things that they want.
Thank you, James. I was going to ask one question before I go out to the audience, but I think you've basically answered the question. I was going to say, well, isn't this all old hat? Isn't this what New Labour were talking about for the past however long it's been? I think that's kind of come out already as part of the discussion. So perhaps I should actually become the advocate for the big society, because I think there's a little bit too much bad feeling around the table. I just want to suggest that it might be an optimistic idea, and one that we should embrace. So the do-it-yourself idea, the idea that parents can run their own schools, that locals can run their own nurseries and community centres, the notion that people can come up with their own solutions to problems, so that the state doesn't need to step in all the time. Now, isn't that something which, whatever our political perspective might be, is something which we might want to embrace, while at the same time asking the question, as perhaps some of us have started to do, why do we need community organisers? Why do they need to be parachuted into our communities? Why do civil servants need to become civic servants, i.e. they don't work behind their desks, they have a community development role? Why do we need a national citizen service for 16-year-olds? Isn't this all a new institution building exercise? Aren't there people out there already who do these things? So I'll just open that question up, and perhaps you might want to respond to anything else which has been said by the other panellists. Steve.
Yeah, on that one. I mean, I didn't mean to sound negative about the big society. I'd question the intention of some of the right wing and the way that they're using language which is progressive to hide an agenda which is really about small state. I think big society, small state is what they believe in. But I think those ideas of empowerment are very important. And to be honest, we don't need all of those new structures that they're creating. So we didn't put Lambeth forward to be a big society pilot because I didn't want people from outside trying to impose a different agenda on us. We're developing our own model. We call it the cooperative council, and it's about trying to level the power relationship, equalise the power relationship between the public services and the people that use them, so between the local state and the local citizenry. And it works in ways, it doesn't need community organisers, for instance. I think the example of violent youth crime on an estate is a very good one. We have estates in inner London, I'm sure in other inner city areas as well, where you will have the majority of young people involved in gangs in one way or another. And some of those gangs will be doing very violent things, including knives, guns, and there will be young people getting killed as a result of that. Now, parents who see their children getting involved in gangs in that way are terrified and want that kind of activity to stop, and they want to get their kids' lives back on track. And in estates all over the country, you will find groups of parents getting together to start taking action to divert their kids away from those kind of activities. A couple in Brixton that I know of, they started setting up a football team, doing dance lessons, doing cookery lessons, getting the kids the opportunity to work in shops. On one estate, one group of parents got 60 kids out of gangs over 3 years, and the only grant they had was a £15,000 grant from the council in that period. The council spends several £100,000 and gets the same number of kids out of gangs. So what if we were to put the resources of the council at the disposal of the community and let them choose what they wanted to do with it? How much better outcomes could we get in terms of diverting young people away from offending? How much better, and at what lower cost than we already do? Now that's empowering citizens, but it's not volunteering. People are choosing to participate because they have a real human need that affects them deeply. In this case, not wanting to see their children get involved in violent youth offending. That is the driver behind them getting involved in this way.
Kevin, you work in community development, so what's your view of these new big society institutions that have been created to encourage our participation in the big society? Are they a help or are they a hindrance?
I really don't know how far they're going to go, and I'm always suspicious of institutions where the framework is imposed from above. I can speak about the approach to community organising, and I think it's important to look at that quite closely. I say that because working in low-income neighbourhoods where people are relatively less affluent, less well-educated, less articulate, less comfortable in taking decisions in the public sphere, it takes a long time to help people to do those things, to articulate their own views, to work together, to influence policy making. Now, part of that is because the policy-making structure is facing the wrong way, and it's great that there's work being done on that. But it is not patronising to say, for instance, as I've found in a neighbourhood where I've been working for quite a while on and off, people are not coming forward. They do not come forward. They are scared. They're exhausted, a lot of them. They're scared, it's a violent neighbourhood. When they go out, there are drug drops, and if they are seen to even observe the drug drops, they feel vulnerable to the consequences, the reprisals and so forth. It's an unhealthy environment. It takes a lot of work, and that work, to me, needs to be underpinned not by some rhetoric from above, but by a sense of certain values to do with inclusion, to do with collaboration, shared learning, equalities and so forth.
Thank you. James?
I think, the idea of parents getting together to help direct what their children do to help get children out of gangs, I think hugely important. Parents coming together to work in common in bringing up their children in communities. Exactly the kind of thing that I think we should be looking at more. I guess my difficulty is not then with those kind of examples, but more on one level with I guess Steve's account that an awful lot of the problems could be about really the question of who controls or who provides certain kinds of services. Because I think it both, I mean, it misunderstands what's going on in services to suggest that the Tories are hijacking a progressive agenda in order to marketise things, given that, as I understand, the previous administration's entire project was one of internal markets and public-private partnerships and all of those kind of things, and indeed the whole issue of choice in public services and people taking control of public services. I'm not entirely convinced that we actually pick up the problem of people feeling incapable of engaging, feeling disinclined to engage in society, and indeed to take more control of their own lives, by suggesting that what they could do is take a bit more control of services. You know, I kind of think that's both a limited aspiration, but I also think it actually misunderstands what it is that's gone on to make them feel so inhibited and disinclined in the first place. So rather than the idea of, you know, a centralised provision of welfare which has led people to play a system and not to take control of their lives, actually an awful lot of the politics of the last couple of decades has been imbued with a sense that actually people really can't take control of their lives, and thus the result of that politics is the sense that people really don't feel able to take control of their lives. That's not a question about who provides services or who controls services, or whether or not people have enough choice in services. So, I mean, in that sense, I'm concerned that we misunderstand both the profundity of the problem, but also that we end up further inhibiting people and I would say in many cases patronising people about actually both what they could aspire towards, but also the role that they could play in actually running their lives without constant assistance and training and all of these kind of things, which will actually have the result of making people think they can't do anything without intervention and training and assistance, which, as I see, is one of the key problems in society at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Right, there are a few people in the room, so we better take the debate out a bit further, I think. Do we have microphones? Yeah. Okay. Lady here.
Okay. We had a big lunch on my road, which was great fun, and we met all the neighbours, and it was fun. And one of the conversations that took place at the big lunch was about one of the neighbours who had been taken to court for environmental dumping. And the reason that what she'd actually done was she'd put her grass clippings outside her back gate. And the Liberal Democrats in one of their campaigns had decided that even though the neighbourhood had been cleaning up the mess outside the back gate for 50 years, suddenly they were going to come and create a community of people who were going to clean up the back passage and not that back passage, but anyway, to clean that up, and they were going to come in and take it over. And they did that. They put letters through everyone's doors saying, if you see anyone dumping anything, please contact this number. And the result was the neighbour getting arrested. So I think, to me, those are two examples in a way of the big society and what happens. And one of my fears is that through this initiative, things that have gone on informally amongst people for years, very happily, suddenly become formalised, and as a result of that, actually become problematic and put people up against the state.
Thank you very much. Just in the middle there behind.
Thank you very much. I mean, Big Society is a great idea. I chair a little community association in Lambeth, actually, and I'm always surprised at the degree of social capital there is in our two roads, or social action as we call it now. I mean, people are willing to act together in various ways. But I think we also have to be pretty careful about attending to the issue that communities are not homogenous, that actually what people want is often highly contested, and that the role of the state, whether nationally or locally, has always been to mediate between competing demands. And there's a flight from that role, and I think there's a real risk of that. You know, people only ever use the word bureaucracy to denigrate public service. The last Labour administrations did nothing but denigrate public servants and public organisations and public enterprise. And yet, you know, the state is about mediating between competing demands. So if we're talking about equality and if we're talking about inclusion, we have to ensure that in our efforts to devolve interest, democracy to local people, we retain that ability at a local level to take very difficult decisions between competing community demands, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that by just raising a question around, in terms of talking about rolling back the state and sort of empowering people to take control of their lives, which I think, you know, is asked us to think about the relationship between the public and the state. Is there a sense here, or could we think about this maybe, in what sense is the state rolling back, and what sense is it actually just withdrawing? And aren't there areas in public life, and there was a mention there of drug dealers on an estate, surely if anything is a responsibility of the state to deal with, it is people dealing in drugs, whether they be in a local estate or wherever they may be. In other words, the enforcement of the law is one thing that you would imagine would be very clearly the business of the state. And I think there's a confusion in my mind, and I think in a lot of our minds, there's a kind of muddle here about who's responsible for what, and at what stage, you know, what does the state do, and what does the public do? And there seems to be, everyone's getting mixed up in everybody else's business here. If the state's telling us how to have lunch and how to talk to each other in informal situations, and sorting out, you know, drug dealing, in local estates, there's a terrible confusion there, and I think it's maybe an interesting area to look at.
Just over here, lady with glasses, just second row.
Hi, yes. I'm a teacher and been working in inclusion units for the past 15 years, and the point obviously the ideas behind Big Society are wonderful and inspiring and very close to my heart and many people's heart. The point I'd like to raise is, which I haven't seen mentioned anywhere, is the very, very mixed messages that are being received, and this tidal wave of absolute crap that parents, teachers, youth workers are having to deal with, coming from top down, of what I would call neoliberal kind of advertising, commercial, the celebrity culture, which is bombarding every single young person, which impacts on our work in schools, in the youth clubs, as parents, where you're having to hold back this set of messages which are expressed through in the video games industry, in the kind of young people wanting to be celebrities, in the clothes that are worn. And it seems to me that this isn't being addressed at all, and anyone that is working in communities knows how much we're having to deal with this. So what is the message? And these are surely coming from top down, to the point where this is how the economy has been surviving. These are sort of the messages of neoliberalism. Gang culture is being played out on the streets. It's just a version of what's being played out on a global scale in terms of its values. It's just a more barbaric, naked version. And it seems to me this isn't being talked about, and it's very, very frustrating.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it at that for the moment. I'll come back out. But I just want to get some quick responses to the questions that have already been asked. So we have the big lunch and grass cuttings. We have is it all about neoliberalism? And then we have the question around two questions. One about are we denigrating public services? Is there something problematic about this rolling back of the state? And who's responsible for what? And I've kind of raised this question myself before. Is there a flight of responsibility from those who should be running society? Is there a problem when politicians effectively hand over the keys and say it's over to you? is that something which is a good thing, or is that something which we should be questioning and saying, well, you know, that's your job? Are there any brief comments on the panel?
I think those are all really interesting points. I'll engage with the one about drug dealing, since that we've already been talking about that. I think there's the first point about what is the state. We're all the state, aren't we? So I think this idea that you can abdicate things to someone else to sort out for you is wrong. In terms of drug dealing on estates, the state apparatus as we know it has been trying to deal with that for years already and has failed. So there's no point saying to it, keep doing what you're doing, because the kids keep getting involved in gangs and they keep getting stabbed and shot, and they're out there selling drugs. It hasn't worked. We need to find a new way to do that. And a way to do that isn't the state abdicating responsibility and pushing it onto that community. That would clearly be wrong. It is trying to put the resources that the public sector has available at the disposal of the people on that particular estate, who know themselves much better what needs to happen on that estate because they live there. They are part of the fabric of it. They understand the dynamics of it and the people that operate there. Now, what an insight that I got when I went to meet Mimi Asher, a woman living on an estate in North Brixton, who became terrified when her teenage boy got involved in a gang, was that she felt that she was best placed to take decisions about what needed to happen. And other parents agreed. They got together, they took action, and they got 60 kids out of gangs on that one estate. Now, that is more than the council does across the whole borough in the same period of time. So we're not trying to abdicate the role of the state in doing that work. We're trying to place the resources of the state at the disposal of the community so that they can do the things that they understand work, because they have a much more profound understanding of the problem in their locality than anybody from outside will have.
Yes, I detect, drawing a couple of threads together, there seems to be a question there about whether vigilantism is going to be a problem, and let's just, I very much hope it isn't, but it sounds as if it could be. This question of, is the enforcement of the law the business of the state, to what extent it is? I think you could say that in some ways you could characterise the big society as a discussion about that very question, about the adjustment of the relationship between citizen and state. And that is in the sense of it being a debate about it and an exploration of it, not necessarily the decisions about that coming to us from above. I very much agree with this point, emphasis made on democracy. If I'd had time, I'd have said something about that myself. We do have this mechanism of helping take decisions at local level when there isn't necessarily consensus. We call it democracy. I'm quite interested in the fact that the role of councillors has not been strengthened in the context of big society. I don't know how many there are in the country, but I think it's roughly comparable with the number of community organisers that's being talked about. What's the relationship between the two? I think there's a question that could be addressed there. And I think this lady's question at the end, I don't have an answer. I think it really does deserve to be addressed. What does the big society have to say about the confusion of messages to young people? It's a bit like, we have to be clear, the big society, the state isn't telling us how to have lunch, actually. It's encouraging us to do things, and there's a whole amount, this is nudge, this is nudge policy, it's not decree, it's coercion. But against whatever coercion and nudging the state comes up with, we've got these powers of the media and the celebritisation and the spectacularisation of culture, which you're saying are problematic, and I think I hear that message quite strongly. It's something that needs to be brought more to the surface, I think.
Okay, any more points from the floor?
Would the panel agree that, certainly my view, with my view of the big society, is that it's a fig leaf almost for the absence of political debate at the national level. So, you know, the less debate and the fewer large ideas that are discussed nationally or internationally, the more we're focusing on the local and the interpersonal, and it's almost like the kind of the culmination of that trend, where the big ideas are replaced by the local kind of pettifogging, bureaucratic ideas, and I think my view is that it's the culmination of that. It's the kind of the expression of the death of politics.
Thank you. That's a useful opportunity to bring James in, because I actually forgot. So, on that point, actually, there is this idea by big society advocates. It's all about baby steps, as Matt Way calls them. And another big society insider calls it. He says that we should be all playing our 1/60 millionth in the building of this new big society. Is it somewhat diminishing, perhaps? And anything else you might want to respond to?
Well, I mean, I think there certainly is a diminishment. If you don't, I mean, I'll leave big society fig leaves and big society grass at the back, or wherever fig leaves and grass should go. I mean, I think that the state issue is quite important, and the idea of the transformation of the state from a body of armed men that regulates at the level of law to a body of whatever it is that trains people how to be good cooks, I think on one level captures something. But not everything, because obviously, and this is really in response, I guess, to the idea that the state mediates between competing demands. Obviously, it does. Historically, that is its role, and that will continue to be its role. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it mediates between those competing demands in the right way, or in the way that best interests me or you or anyone else. Which is to say, I'm not the state, and I'm actually quite sure that Mimi Asher isn't the state, really. I'm a citizen of the state. And one way that we hold that state to account is through politics, through the existence of a civil society which is distinct from the state, where we come together to pursue our interests, to petition the state, to make demands of the state. And I guess, I mean, I think there's something very, very interesting in that notion, both that actually we're all the state, we're all in it together. I'm slightly dubious that we necessarily are, or that all the interests that might be put forward are necessarily the ones that I would want to go to. But I think that notion of a blurring of my role as a citizen and where I sit, and the state's role, is indicated quite clearly in the fact that, as part of the Big Society project, what was once called the Office for the Third Sector in the Home Office has been closed down and replaced, if you like, by the Office for Civil Society. So from the notion that civil society is where I am as a citizen, and the state is doing something slightly different to what I do as a citizen, to the notion that the state now has an office through which it can improve civil society on my behalf, I think that kind of speaks volumes to the notion of what I am as a citizen, and the notion that I could actually do anything on my own behalf without the state telling me how to reorganise civil society at the very sphere in which I'm supposed to have the freedom to make claims of the state and to challenge the state.
I see some more hands. In the middle there, please.
Thank you. I'm glad I had a chance to speak. Joyce McMillan, journalist and civic activist in Scotland. I've just finished spending 4 years sitting on an inquiry funded by the Carnegie Trust UK into the future of civil society in the whole of the UK and Ireland. It was chaired by Jeff Mulgan. Here's its little summary report, which is called Making Good Society. And you might or might not agree with the conclusions of the report, but it is absolutely stuffed, particularly if you read the whole thing, with information about what is really going on in the big society of the UK and Ireland. And there is a hell of a lot going on. And I would say there are two sort of conclusions that I would like to draw your attention to, although these are inflected by me, if you like, but they are strongly indicated by the findings of the report. The first is that the lurking idea of crowding out, which lies behind this big society idea, i.e. the idea that the state has been crowding out civic endeavour and has to pull back in order to sort of unleash the creativity of the people, there is very, very little real evidence for that. In most situations where civic action is needed, the state and civil society act in synergy, and often voluntary activity will collapse if certain key forms of state support are removed, and that is more and more true the more vulnerable the communities you're talking about are. So the idea of crowding out is basically false. And secondly, what we found about civil society in both the UK and Ireland was that it's extremely active, that a lot of people, despite stress on their time and everything else, take on a huge amount of responsibility, do a huge amount of work across huge range of areas. And one of the things that annoys me about this government, actually, is the patronising tone in which they tell their grannies, literally, how to suck eggs in terms of raising money, in terms of new ideas about how to raise money, in terms of seeking money from charities, seeking money from philanthropy, seeking money from private sponsors. Everybody involved in civil society in Britain has been doing that for years, so I don't know who they'll be talking to. But anyway, the thing that we found about these organisations is that they're very, very active, but what they increasingly feel is not disengaged, but disempowered. They feel that when the real deal comes to be cut, it's cut between people like David Cameron and people like Rupert Murdoch, and they are not there. So they do a lot of work, and in the end, their opinions count for nothing. That's the real issue of power that we face, and everything else is just window dressing.
Right in the back there, in the far corner, back left.
I completely support what she just said, because I'm one of the people who work with NLDC funding that's going to be cut now in February. And the thing that we have done for several years in revving up the community, getting people into work, getting people who have been unemployed and disengaged from the economy for 4 or 5 years, and the amount of work it's taken to get them to this point is all wiped away with no free lunch in the country, big lunch in the city where I come from. So I completely support what she's saying.
Okay. Right at the back. In the middle there, please.
Okay, just to the chap in white, I didn't get your name. Because if this issue about the role of the state and how it's changed, I mean, because I do take your point entirely about the issue of crime and the way people in the community might be able to deal with crime more effectively. And one of these statistics, one of the things that's cited quite a lot is that, people in the UK are less likely to intervene if youths are smashing up a bus shelter van in Germany. So there is something in that, and for that reason, I think a lot of this voluntarism stuff is very attractive. I think the issue, however, is opposed to people made this point, but why do you need the state to enable that? Is it because you're saying that people are not doing that? Because if it was, then I think there are problems with getting the state involved in that. I mean, because I think people can organise themselves, but I don't want the state anywhere near that. The state might provide services. I think they should. But I do think there are good things in the idea of the big society in terms of people organising. But I do think the discussion about what the world the division of world should be. So I don't think the state and individuals should be necessarily merged.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to set aside the question of the state for a moment, and ask the panel to kind of comment on the relationship between values and community. Because I live in Upminster, and one recent survey showed that it had the highest rate of social capital of any part of London. I'll give you an illustration of that. When my tyre was stolen by 2 lads, my next door neighbour didn't phone the police, she chased after them. And I was a bit worried, I'm in fact glad she didn't catch them. And I just kind of wondered why she might do that. And one of the things I would say about Upminster is that there is a homogeneity of values that maybe builds community. And it seems that maybe with a lot of the discussion around community building, the question of values tends to be avoided.
Actually, I didn't know what Toby was going to say just then. He's my brother-in-law, but my point is quite similar in some ways. I live in a little village in Norfolk. I'm very busy, my husband's very busy, and we're very happy for our village committee to make decisions on our behalf. But last summer we went along to help to put the tent up on the common for the village fete. And the leader of the committee made the comment that he wondered how many Paki families you could fit in this tent. In the meantime, my Indian husband was down the other end helping a lady to carry a table in. We are the only mixed race family in the village. It did make me question who I was letting run affairs in my village, and it does raise the question, who are these people? And as Toby's just said, what values do we want from these people who are going to suddenly run our communities? And a slightly different point, second point, I would be interested to know what the panel think about the gender question in all of this, and how far this volunteerism is going to fall on women in our society.
I'll take one more question if there's any. At the front here, please.
I feel that the big society is a good idea, but I think the idea is not supported or helped by the actions the government's taking. Like, firstly, I'll consider the National Citizen Service. It also seems a good idea, but the actual details mean it's destined to fail. Currently, the idea is that you'll take students and people who just finished year 11 from all over the country to come together for a week to do some activities. The activities on the programme so far are extremely lame, naff. The ideas have already happened, like build a tent. I think people have already done that in Scouts. What's more, it's costing students £500, so there will probably be a certain type of people who will join to the National Citizen Service. It will hardly bring people together. And then on top of that, after the National Citizen Service, they wish people to do volunteering. Now, the government's considering cutting certain volunteering organisations. One of those is Be Involved. Over the last few years, they've generated over millions of volunteering opportunities within the country. And I'm personally, as a judge at the national level, seeing some of the great things that people have done to bring the community together. Now, to cut this and set up a new idea seems ridiculous. What's more, there's also a Youth Action Fund in many local councils. This fund, I've also witnessed, is given to people who have new ideas to bring the community and young people together. This is also being cut and all thing, and new ideas are being put in place, new funding to new programs are being put in place. I think with the big society, if it is to work, it has to figure out how to utilise the services that are already available. People have done work. Society has always been around. And I think if the big society is to work, they've got to, instead of trying to have a new idea that sounds good, that will be good for the television, good for the PR, the spin doctors, they need to figure out what's happened so far, and let's work with what we've done. And that way, it can, instead of just being an idea, it can achieve the potential it has.
So this, for instance, comes along to replace the Youth Involvement Charity. Does the state need to be enabling? There's the question about values, village committees. Is the big society a good idea, but destined to fail when you look at the detail? So I'll start with Steve.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, those contributions there pulled out an awful lot of the things that we've been working with on our commission over the last few months. We needn't have bothered to just come here and ask you lot. But that's because the really profound thing under this, I think, is do we want to roll back the state, or do we want to change the role of the state? And I think politically the right would like to roll back the state, pull the rug from under communities and leave them to sink or swim in order to allow space for the market to come in. I sincerely believe that's what they want to do. But we can have an alternative. We can change the role of the state to empower communities and give them the tools they need to make the change that they need to happen. Now, Doris and other people were dead right. You can't do that if those communities don't have the capacity and the support to enable them to exercise that power. And that is the big risk, I think, with some of the cuts that are being made at the moment. They're not really looking at the long-term outcomes, and they're disempowering communities by taking away infrastructure that could support them to take decisions for themselves. I think, too, that empowerment means we move to a model of participation. It's not about volunteering, it's participating, because the people that use services or live in particular communities have a much more profound insight into what needs to happen there than people from outside who are professionals. So they need to be taking the choices as a matter of handing power to them, rather than abdicating it to other people who don't understand the problem in the same way. So I think the big idea in all this really is empowerment, and I don't think that is a small thing at all. It's very, very powerful.
Wow, there was quite a lot of stuff there to deal with. It's reassuring to hear the emphasis put on the point that crowding out is unsupported, because I think that's a hugely important point to make. On the question, let me just pick up on the point about young people very, very quickly. Young people can spot a hidden agenda a mile away, and having that forced on them is not very tasteful. They don't like to be surveilled either. Who does? Come on, we need to think of something better than that. I want to just pick up on this question about values. I think it's really important. I didn't avoid it. I emphasised it quite heavily, I thought, the importance of values. But there is a question in your neighbourhood: why are your values any more important than others, or under what basis do they take any superiority? And I think here the question is about what we regard as community. And I said earlier, this implication that it's there's a natural consensus there is highly dubious and suspect. It's like, it needs to be said that community development is not a mechanism for ensuring that people are governed or governable. So what I would say is something like this, I suppose. Community is a space where we assert commonality over our differences, but we don't deny our differences. So maybe that's the way that it needs to be looked at. You raise a really important question about you seem to be saying who's coming in to take decisions on our behalf if it's not the elected state. And I think that's something that maybe does need to be looked at. Why are we talking suddenly about other people, not elected, coming in and taking decisions on our behalf? It's other members of what I understand to be a fairly cohesive community. So we don't know enough about the ingredients which make for high levels of social capital in a locality, but I suspect it's more likely to be to do with economic comparability than to do with ethnic and other background factors.
Thank you. James?
Well, I too think the values point is important, and I guess what we see in your community with a cohesive sense of values, where your neighbour chases after the stealers of your wheels, is that actually she's not a person who has the relevant training or expertise to do that kind of thing. And what she clearly doesn't know is that rather than chasing after the people who have the wheels, there should be somebody in the community who actually can take responsibility for that kind of thing with the right training, who she can call on your behalf. That, I think, is the difficulty. The question is actually what kind of values, and those values are actually that are being propagated, I think, are values of a certain sense of what it is to be a good citizen, a certain sense of what it is to be a good moral person. Which closes down as many possibilities for engagement as it opens up. Which is not to say that I'm putting forward an idea that the state has crowded out community action, or that the state has crowded out civic engagement. I think the reality of all our lives is that we all know many people engage in the world, many of us engage in the world, many of us take responsibility in our neighbourhoods. That's all there. The interesting question, I think, is how we come to re-understand what that engagement means. On one level with this whole discussion, we are encouraged to re-understand what is, I think, a perfectly straightforward and quite natural and perhaps even spontaneous way of relating to people around us, that we now transform into a political responsibility of good citizenship. And in transforming it into a political responsibility of good citizenship, what it obviously means is that there are certain ways of doing it right and certain ways of doing it wrong. And it may then be that the people who are doing it wrong need to have their funding cut in order that we can put more of those funds into training people the right way to do it. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that actually there is a troublesome agenda about values which is incredibly limiting and disabling going on. And actually, just to stop being cynical or sceptical for a final sentence, I actually think we both do engage already in the world and are perfectly capable of creating, call it liberalism, responsibility, big society, whatever you want to call it, a better society for us to live in. What I'm not convinced is that we either need to be told how we ought to do that or trained how we ought to do that, and I'm certainly not convinced that what's being suggested as the way to do that is actually correct at the moment. So I think the big society, if it's anything, ought to mean us rejecting a bit more of the kind of patronising attitude and taking a bit more control of our own lives for ourselves and with each other.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think we've necessarily answered the question, what is the big society? But I think we've probably asked a few more questions that we need to discuss elsewhere. So please take part in the Social Policy Forum if you get an opportunity. We're on the website. And please thank our speakers.